Welcome to the panel on foreign intervention in Africa, run by the Oxford Society for International Development. My name is Jonathan, and I'm co-moderating with Helena. And we're delighted to have a wide range of experts in African field of development for today's discussion. It would be nice if you could introduce yourselves. So I suppose we'll start with kind of the order that I see on Zoom. So Shantha, if you'd like to go first.
Hi, I'm Shantha Blumen. I'm head of a small startup called Mobility for Africa. I spent the last 20 years working in international development, many of them in Africa, with the UN, UNICEF.
Thank you. Guy?
Yeah, so Guy Lafferty. I actually grew up in Zambia, educated in Zimbabwe, 15 years finance Wall Street in London, then set up and was at a family office, single family office in London for 25 years. And then 5 years ago joined Third Way Africa, which is an investment impact bank as a partner.
Thank you. Yvonne?
My name is Demary Von Kemedy. I am the CEO of Alluvial and Angala FinTech, working in agriculture and SME financial services, respectively.
Thank you. Gonzalo?
Hi, everyone. I'm Gonzalo Neves Correa. Originally from Portugal, grew up in Spain, spent 20 years between the US and UK, and then 7 years ago, decided to focus on Africa, and I set up Third Way Africa, where I'm Guy's partner, and I look after the advisory side of the business primarily, but also support Guy on the investment side. And I'm Guy's +1 into.
And Jared?
Yeah, my name is Jared Osoro. I currently work for FSD Africa, which is a specialized agency for supporting the integration and deepening of the financial sector in Africa. Previously working in the financial sector over the last 19 or so years, Kenya Bank Association Director for Research, East African Development Bank, where I was Chief Economist and covering 5 countries within East Africa. And I'm very glad to be here. Born and bred in Nairobi, studied in Nairobi, Harare, a bit of UK, and worked substantially in Uganda, where the East African Development Bank was based. But I'm in Nairobi for the last 9 years.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. So we'll be discussing a range of topics about some of the most controversial, really, issues in international foreign intervention in Africa and development there. So I think one of the most pertinent ones to start with is perhaps to ask whether NGOs should be the driving factor in foreign development, or whether profit-led initiatives are more effective. And given that we have quite a range of expertise here, perhaps it's most helpful to start, if I can direct that question at you, Jared, to start, given your role in the credit markets. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting and philosophical question, because I actually see no binary choice between the two. Because development obviously requires funding, and funding comes from various sources. So if you look at investment, that is a prerequisite for investment. And you look at it in an uncommercial sense, then you obviously know that the profit-oriented kind of funding is necessary. But the more accurate way, or the more how I see it, is where you look at both the social side of investment and the commercial side of investment as being very critical for purposes of supporting development. Now, as you may appreciate, there are several ways in which investments can be funded. It could be domestic, it could be international. And in the domestic context, there are some elements of development that are funded using government resources. Now, government resources are usually limited, and that's why typically governments have budget deficits. And sometimes you find philanthropic resources coming to augment some of those resources. And even commercial resources are not always abundantly available And if you look in the totality of things, many of our economies in Africa have what we call a savings gap, where the savings that exist are substantially lower than the investment requirements of our economies. So what that therefore means is that, there has to be a bridging of that gap using external resources. The philanthropic resources or the NGO type of resources usually come to support the social side of investments mainly. And I think they do a very important role to bridge that part of the gap. And the commercial side that is not funded locally essentially comes from what you can call the savings that are mobilized externally. So what tends to happen, therefore, is a conglomeration of all those resources support really the resources that are required for development. Now, if you were to look at whether there's a choice between philanthropy and commercially inclined resources, you'll be pushed to distinguish between the two because in instances, the resources that are channeled through the NGOs come from foundations and such kind of enterprises, which then have channeled those resources from profit-oriented institutions. So you find that, there are agencies such as, the Bill and Melinda Gates, the MasterCard Foundation and all those other, which essentially have a link to businesses. So there's a nexus between profit-oriented kind of resource generation and what comes from philanthropy. So from where I sit, I actually see the two as reinforcing each other, with one not being sufficient without the other. And therefore, it will be very nice to calculate a balance between the two, because if you see one leaning in one direction, there could be an element, an essence of trade-offs. Because if you see a certain country being funded substantially by philanthropic resources and less from profit-oriented resources, then you're essentially saying that, the resources that go to philanthropy come from highly profitable institutions that could be in a way entrenching a sense of inequality. So it's really a case of looking at how the two will balance and not necessarily a choice between one or the other. That's really how I see it.
Shanta, do you have something to counter with that?
No, I mean, I very much agree with Jared, but I think the challenge is we have to look at power and the dynamics. And development has traditionally been driven by those that have power and that dictate then what happens on the ground. And if we look back, most African countries got their independence in the 1960s, and then maybe they only had a few university graduates who were qualified to bring in some of this complex technology or, adapt and build policy. But we're now in a different era. And I think the traditional development aid sector has not adapted to this new reality. So it's still very top down. It still underestimates local capacity. And there's lots of middlemen in the game. So I don't think it's is it philanthropy or is it capital investment? I think they both have an enormous play a role to play. I think essentially it's what is the intent and how does it reach the purpose it's meant to serve? And having spent many years in a very top-down bureaucracy, the danger is there's lots of waste. And essentially, so I would be advocating now for a much more grassroots approach to funding. And when you talk about NGOs, traditionally we think of international NGOs and the big players in the West that raise the money from charitable giving. But there's been an abundance of small community development initiatives, and they're the ones that ultimately do the work on the ground. And so how do we support both domestic philanthropy and charitable giving in Africa that addresses inequality, but also redirect international solidarity to be much more about listening and trying to give people some agency rather than pretending that we fly in and solve the problem for them. So I think there is a shift happening. There's a lot of debate in the development aid sector, but it's not moving fast enough because I would say there's still lots of vested interests, and the funding is still predominantly based on a charitable model of, Africans being needy and, needing us to write a check. And then we want a quick solution rather than really addressing the power dynamic.
Thank you for that. Fawn, perhaps if you have something to add. No need, but if you do. I think you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, I think, yeah.
I think I can just add that whatever the sources of the financing are, what is important is to make sure that there is a profit-oriented way of providing this support. For instance, I think that people in rural areas, for instance, need more support with their supporting their sources of livelihood. So access to finance for livelihood support, then they will be able to afford to pay for the other things they need, rather than providing those things they need, like say water, for instance, for free. But then if you have free water and no money to maintain the water service, then it runs for a couple of months and that's the end of it. So we just have to see it that way. Yes, it is philanthropy, but let it go from the profit side of it, so people are able to make a living, and then they can afford things that need to be supported financially to continue to be sustainable.
Cheers, thank you. Guy or Gonzalo, would you like to add?
I can go first if you like. I mean, basically, and philosophically, I don't think there is a place for the two. I think if there's going to be any, then it should be in education only. I think the misalignment of interests outweighs any benefits. So if all of that money that was available to Africa went to education, then in the next 20 years, I think the transformation would be immense. And that would be my, in an absolute sense, that would be my view, that we should only consider it for education. We shouldn't consider it for any other purpose. Africans are unbelievably entrepreneurial. And it would just be, I think, a huge benefit to the continent if we cut it out. We didn't have this misalignment of interests. And then if we're going to give anything money, we should give it to education.
And can I just add, we should be a bit more ambitious with education. So when we were working towards the MDG goals, it was for universal primary school education. And to suggest that the continent can move into the 21st century with just primary school education shows also how narrowly we were considering transformation.
Yeah, all of the data, you look at somewhere like Bangladesh or somewhere like that, all of the data tells you that to kind of, for a population to stabilize, and get to economic balance, then it's key to educate women. And that's, to me, is if Tanzania is going to be 300 million people at the end of the century, we've got a huge problem on our hands. And the only way to help alleviate that problem is to educate women.
Yeah, certainly without discounting education, I think it's also good to look at other needs in terms of, the other social needs that are equally important. Education obviously will solve many things, but you have to look at the social spectrum and look at what kind of priorities there are. And to my mind, I think the biggest critique I've seen of resources being channeled in a prescriptive manner is in a way that the local people who are supposed to be beneficiaries have no say in where those resources go. And that is basically what I call a solution in search of a problem. You anticipate that no, people, this is what they require. So I think we have to be a bit balanced in how we think about this.
I think I completely agree with that, Jared. And I know that FSD does a lot of work on essentially deepening the financial sector in the continent. And in my opinion, this is kind of a very contextually important data point, which is that the financial sector is changing at a very quick pace the way that it thinks about allocating capital. And things like social and environmental impact are now part of the asset allocation conversation. That wasn't the case before. So whether philanthropy and NGOs should be driving development, it doesn't really matter. The point is that there are other players that are now going to have a say and are now going to have a mandate to think about development outcomes in addition to the other components of their mandate. And so, in my opinion, what this is going to drive is the fact that the best ideas will be the ones that will actually drive development. Because now, back to Shanta's point, the power is much more balanced, right? You don't need development funding from NGOs and from development agencies to have a shot at seeing the light of day if you are a good idea, a good enterprise. You now have a larger pool of resources, in particular financial resources, that have a mandate to look at what you're doing. And so there's a kind of a balancing act of who's got power in the conversation that wasn't there 5-10 years ago. And a lot of that, in my opinion, is because of this kind of shift that we are seeing in the world of finance and financial markets. And if the different players, if Wall Street is willing to cross over to Development Street and vice versa, what you have is a system where the kind of the sum of the parts is greater than the individual components, right? Where philanthropy can have a multiplier effect because it is buying down risk that maybe today commercial capital doesn't yet understand, but by doing that has a much better shot of mobilizing a larger amount of development capital, of commercial capital. And so what you end up is in an equation where you have a significant amount of investment capital available, right? Multiples of what that development capital today is, but that it only comes in if development capital is willing to play its part. And this opens up, quote unquote, the floodgates, and not yet, but I think we will see this over the next few years. And when you have a larger amount of resources available, the best ideas will then also have their share in that power balance. And so hopefully what we'll see is a lot more demand-driven development. Money will flow to where it's actually needed rather than to where the people that are controlling the purse strings thinks that it will go.
No worries. The role of domestic government in kind of the multi-pronged approach to promoting development, and the role of domestic government in allying with foreign actors.
Obviously, the governments have a big role to play insofar as aligning resources towards the developmental needs are concerned. I mean, governments are the ones that are champions of the strategic plans that they make towards economies developing certain ways. And I think some of the decisions by governments have an implication in development, whether positive or negative. We see governments seeking resources well beyond their means in the domestic and external markets with a view to championing development, but in a way ending up frustrating development aspirations. So decisions made by government actually have a clear implication in how development happens. If you look at Africa, we've seen a number of countries which through resource allocation have led their countries really growing very fast out of investments that they have been made through resource mobilization. But what is clear about many of those countries that the social indicators are not necessarily reflective of the fast growth. So you find that countries, I can give you an example. The Ethiopian country has been growing very fast over the last 10 years, to an extent of it becoming among the top 10 countries as far as growth is concerned. Its total output has doubled over the period. But if you look at the social indicators, they don't reflect that fast growth insofar as poverty, education, and health is concerned. So the decisions by government to seek resources externally, which resources are deployed to investment in infrastructure, which is critical for development, has seen fast growth, but not necessarily the core areas of development of livelihood. So you cannot talk about development without having governments and the decision of government in the equation.
I mean, just to add, I think it's true. Policy and the right decisions are critical. So money is one. Finance is obviously a big issue to how we improve social welfare and improve the development indicators in the continent. But the policies and how that money is allocated. And I think we have a danger sometimes that we don't have necessarily a pro-rural or a pro-poor or a pro-gender approach. And that's up to leadership and vision and who is driving the decision making. So we have challenges within government processes to make sure that we get those right policies and incentives in place to encourage. Because what we've got to remember is, Africa is is still predominantly rural, and the way it was colonized was very much with, you know, the centers being in capital cities. And so there's been devolution in many countries, including in Kenya, and now in Zimbabwe they're starting. But how do we make sure that that also allocates resources to some of the poorer parts? And that is about priorities and government trying to do the best for its population.
Yeah, I would make one more kind of broad point that when we talk about governments, we actually mean the institutions of the country, right? And to go back to Shanta's point about, you know, when these countries all became independent, mostly in the 60s, you know, their ability to build, you know, functioning central banks, to build kind of functioning, staffed judicial processes, civil service, and you know, I guess if we're all going to believe in a capitalist society, then, you know, public markets need to be functioning properly as well. And so it's not just, you know, in my view, the government challenge. It's also that, you know, those institutions that make, you know, these kind of complex societies function properly are missing in, or are very thin in terms of the people that staff them in these countries.
To add with Guy, I think one of the important things is the danger then is the representation of how that is perceived. So I worked in public relations and communication, but then the narrative is easy to just make it's all about government problems in Africa and government corruption and incompetence, rather than really look at the checks and balances and the institutional capacity. So it can lead to a very simplistic narrative, especially in the West, that can be reinforced in, you know, that all of Africa's problems are inherent, rather than actually looking at that that complexity.
Perfect. Thank you so much. The next question, which is directed at you, Shanta, is one view is that the Chinese model of development in Africa is motivated by profit and influence that is to the benefit of the Chinese economy. Does this necessarily mean that these initiatives are not beneficial for the African host countries? Would it be better for foreign governments to support domestic initiatives rather than developing their own?
So I spent the last 3 years of my career working in Beijing, and it was a great opportunity to obviously understand better the Chinese decision making from the central government. I wouldn't say from all aspects of society. And I think the China-Africa conversation is much more complex than it's often represented. China has been engaging in Africa as a partner in the non-aligned movement, in the Global South conversation. And I think you can't just dismiss that it's only there to seek profit. I think there's some very good Chinese businessmen, just like there are some good American and British businessmen that come to the continent to purely seek profit, and that might not always uphold the best environmental or human rights standards. But I think when you look at the Chinese government and the commitment to Africa, it is maybe driven sometimes by their own experience of development, which was fairly successful in lifting millions of people out of poverty. But obviously translating that then into the continent is very different. As we know, it doesn't have a strong centralized government. And so I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding. And I think China has filled a very important void in the last 10 years because it's been investing in infrastructure. And there's a huge infrastructure deficit. And to be frank with you, no one else was financing infrastructure. And if you go to China, you understand they're very good at building infrastructure and they do it very quickly. And so it is their comparative advantage. And they've also basically made it easier to finance that infrastructure through their own banks and government institutions. So they often do get the bid because they can offer the best rates. I don't think that is bad. I think it's forced a rethink. If we look now at the US government, they've just set up their own development finance corporation. They've had to rethink pretty hard what their comparative advantage is in Africa. I don't think it's useful to see China and the West as competitors in Africa. I think the conversation is how Africa leverages whatever investment is on the table to its own advantage and to its own agenda. And there is no reason that African governments can't be better at negotiating finance or terms. But to just sort of say it's a war or a competition is very counterproductive. I think the Chinese can offer a lot. I think it's how you engage them. So I think there are layers of complexity and a lot of mythology even about the debt that China's just wanting to swallow countries by getting them into debt, which, to be frank with you, we still have big bilateral debt problems and multilateral debt problems. So I'm not as pessimistic or as negative, and I don't think it has to be a competitive approach in the continent. It's not constructive. There's a hell of a lot to do. We have a shortage of investment in all these important sectors. So yeah, I think there's some very good academics that are debunking some of the myths and trying to bring some more nuance. And China has a problem. It's often not very transparent in the way it communicates and not very good at how it communicates. So not to be an apologist, but I think that there needs to be a lot more nuance.
Thank
You're on
you.
mute.
Thank you for shedding some more light on that discussion, Shanta. Is there anyone who has something to add to this discussion, perhaps?
I think I will agree completely with her that African countries and African businesses should not have to choose between China, the West, or even between other African countries and the West or China as sources of investment. We have to look at the entire world. We have to look at what is available, and we decide on which one we go with in every specific instance based on what is good for us. I will emphasize every specific instance because it is not going to be a general decision to say, in this case, in construction, we are with China. In this other area, we are with Germany or the US. And I think this is the same with every other country in the world. The world is now a global village. This discussion about whether it has to be with the West or with China is very counterproductive. Africa is owing a number of companies and governments, both in the West and in China. So when we come to the issue of debt, it's something we have to look at holistically, whether our debts are sustainable, never mind where it is coming from. Of course, it just happens that at this moment, China is one of the leading countries in the world when it comes to liquidity. So not only is Africa owing China, but America is also owing China. I don't know if Britain is also owing China, but a lot of people are owing China. So we just have to be concerned about whether our debts are sustainable and whether they are applied to the right things so as to have the right multiplier effect for the overall development of the continent.
One point that may be worth, I don't know, discussing, whatever, is the Chinese. I mean, what they've done in the last 30 years is extraordinary. But I think for us in Africa, it's a huge opportunity. They are willing to build infrastructure and they're willing to finance it, but they've gone calorie deficit, and so we have, in Africa, a huge opportunity to provide them with those calories in whichever form we decide to try and provide it. I think it's a huge opportunity. So they and the Indians are in a big chunk of the world population, and China's already calorie deficit, and India is going calorie deficit, and that's not going to change. If you look at the data on the number of pork, number of pigs, number of cattle that they have, they're just almost a straight line up in the air. And so I think Africa can become a huge partner of the Chinese, and that to a large extent is where we should be kind of focusing our efforts, I think, embracing them and opening up those markets to the agricultural sector.
And maybe just to add, there are a lot of a new generation of Chinese that are, I think, you know, there's been a generational shift, and a lot of very young, dynamic Chinese that are very engaged in the world and that know how to cross, you know, continents and have educated in multiple countries. And I've met some of them working in the continent for some of the big telecom companies and Transition and some of the other investors here, and they do approach the problem very differently, and they're much more open-minded than some of the, you know, old school, you know, more conservative Chinese that have been in the past. So I think there's a huge opportunity for Africa's young people to also engage. I think one of the challenges is obviously it's learning both sides. You know, we need to encourage more understanding of Africa and the fact it's a very complex continent with many countries, but we also need to understand China better, and we need to understand the complexity of how decisions are made and the different multiple actors, which is not always easy. But I agree with Guy. If we leverage it, there's huge possibility for the continent to see it as a global trading partner. I mean, there's only 3% of global trade, you know, from the continent. And we know the most of that is mineral based and oil based. So we have an opportunity to leverage that, I think, for something much more valuable.
Thank you. And now, excuse me, carry on.
Just a couple of additional comments about China-Africa relationship. The way I look at it in the context of Africa, China, and Africa versus the rest of the world, not in a competing way. I think if you take an historical perspective, you will appreciate that Africa has always been open to global economic power, whether voluntary or not. That's a fact. And I think depending on what time in history you're looking at this, that relationship has been very positive, of course, with side effects. What I want to emphasize around China is the point that has been made by the others around the willingness and ability to finance Africa's investment requirements. So when you talk about FDI, you see foreign direct investment from China coming to some sectors, mainly the extractive industry and oil. And part of that goes into the deals they have to make insofar as funding infrastructure is concerned. Now, we may argue here that we have debt from the other countries, and China is a net lender to many other countries. But there's one thing that China has brought to the equation: the speed at which it commits to funding infrastructure in Africa is very important, because a transaction to fund a railway line that could ordinarily take 5 years takes a very short time to be put into implementation, which is a positive thing. But the negative thing, and we have to appreciate both the positive and the negative, that the Chinese debt is substantially commercial than what we've gotten used to in terms of funding infrastructure. And the tenor is short. That has started to put the African countries under pressure in terms of the obligations from time to time. So the only thing to do there is not to condemn that Chinese debt is making us indebted, but to see how we can strengthen that profile, lengthen the maturity profile of that debt so that it can continue supporting Africa's investment initiatives. So I think that's an additional point I needed to make about China and how it's meaningfully contributing to Africa's development. But the other is really to say and emphasize that, you know, sometimes we let other people make the narrative for Africa so far as our development aspirations are concerned. I think Africa has to start making its own narrative. If I can give you an example, I mean, Africa has been described in many ways by the Economist publication. The Economist usually revisits Africa after a few years. In 2000, it was talking about the hopeless continent. In 2001, it was talking about Africa's elusive dawn. By 2011, it was Africa rising. By 2013, it was Africa aspiring. By 2019, it's the new scramble for Africa. I think Africa can define itself through initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, where you know there are positive things that can happen in the continent, supported by partners that help develop our capacity to utilize the scope that we have. So that's really an additional comment I'll make in the broader context of how Africa relates to the rest of the world, not just with China.
Thank you for that insight, Jarrett. To move slightly further afield from China, if not far, I'd like to address the kind of the Asian tigers concept and that model of export-oriented industrialization, which is an economic policy to create growth through protection and support of infant industries that has been followed with success by these particular countries in East Asia in particular. The question I'd like to raise is, can this model work in an African context, or are African institutions and infrastructure better suited to an approach that focuses perhaps on a more rural or service sector approach to development? And Fon, do you think you?
I think there has not been a significant divergence in terms of how countries have historically made progress. It's started always with agrarian reform, people having more access to land, bringing the land closer together, commercialization of agriculture. That follows with industrialization, which is often agricultural based, moving to light manufacturing, more complex manufacturing. And as a country moves into more complex manufacturing, other countries take over light manufacturing because of cost of labor and the general dispersal of knowledge and ideas. So this has happened from Britain to across Western Europe, the US, Japan, China, and now we see, you just talked about East Asia, and the Far East Asia and Africa are more or less in the same cohort now. So it's expected that light manufacturing will lead the progress that is required. They will create the jobs that are required in Africa. Africa is not going to suddenly move straight to knowledge-based economic progress. However, the fact that there's a lot more infrastructure now, particularly data infrastructure, means that access to opportunities are more readily available, and we do not have to spend the same number of years that China had to spend. We can leapfrog in a number of areas. And what has happened in the technology sector, in telecoms, is one example in that regard. And I think the same will happen in electricity, in power as well, and that will have an overriding, a very significant impact on how quickly Africa can develop. Thank you.
I think we've got to be quite careful when we think about what the future industrial revolution in Africa looks like, because I don't think we can replicate what happened in China and the East Asian countries, because the world has kind of changed so much. So I think for me, it's very much a green revolution. It's not an industrial revolution. If we're going to have a shirt factory in Nairobi built in the next 5 years, it won't employ anybody. That's my concern. That's what makes me nervous. It'll all be robotic. And so I think the revolution, it does need to be focused on the rural areas, and it does need to be green. If we think that Africa can kind of compete industrially, that's great. I don't see why not, but it won't employ people. That's what makes me very nervous.
Just to add, sorry, go ahead, Jared.
Sorry, Santa. I'll have a slightly different perspective from Guy. It's true that the export-led growth model was very successful in Asia, to an extent of being described as a miracle, even if it was not a miracle because it was essentially propelled by heavy investments in education, to emphasize, and other social needs and infrastructure. And that was a growth model that was very successful. Why I say it's possible to industrialize is because Africa has learned from its failed experiment of import substitution. Africa tried to substitute what it was importing as opposed to fronting itself to be an industrial base for purposes of export. I think what we need to acknowledge is that you cannot industrialize in a vacuum. You need to look at what are the prerequisites for you to actually industrialize. And that will entail, of course, the challenge that we've embarked on in terms of fiscal infrastructure. But look at what kind of technologies you're going to put in play. Of course, robotics and all that will be part of the technology, but to argue that using technology will not necessarily lead to creation of jobs for this stretching the argument of what technology can do. I think you have to start looking at what fintech can do in so far supporting our industrialization, and also the green agenda, where green here does not necessarily mean going rural and going agriculture. Green could mean, deploying technologies that are really good for the environment. And I say that there are quite a number of recent scholarly work that has been done on Africa, which indicates that we risk Africa prematurely deindustrializing if we argue that Africa cannot industrialize. And I say so because if Africa has to meaningfully trade amongst itself, meaning intra-Africa trade, you cannot look at agriculture and such kind of other enterprises to be the springboard for sustainable growth in Africa. And finally, if you needed any evidence that Africa actually needed to industrialize, you just need to look at how frustrating it has been during the pandemic to even import basic medical supplies. We need to have some of those things, and those can only happen if we really take industrialization very seriously. So I think there's room for Africa to industrialize. There's room for Africa to adopt new technologies, and there's room for Africa really to look at how it can move away from this dependence on high volatile commodities that are even a source of volatility, fragility.
And can I just add on building on what Jared just said, I think we also have to understand that Africa went through its deindustrialization period, as you talked about, with the import substitution for various reasons. But essentially, there hasn't been any incentive to help move African economies forward in this way. So, okay, we have WTO rules that often aren't in the continent's favor. We have barriers to trade and value-added production that need to be sorted out. We need to be fair. And at the moment, trade is not fair, and global rules are not going to help Africa move in the right direction. I mean, I think you're right. We have the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which could unleash enormous potential if we can increase trade between countries. But we do need to have a technology transfer in certain sectors. We need to be much more open to sort of a longer term gain in investing the types of skills in these sectors. Medical, pharmaceuticals is a huge one. Why not? This is a continent of 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people. How can we not have a successful drug industry that's homegrown? And that's going to require a certain level of long-term vision and capital investment and technology transfer. And I think, unfortunately, and going back to mention China, one of the reasons they developed is they have 5-year plans and they think long-term. And unfortunately, typically in the West, we have short-term political horizons, we have short-term financial horizons, and we don't think long-term. So I think it's a shift in thinking, and it's not going to be quick or easy. I love the revolution going on in fintech, but I don't think all of the continent's problems can be solved just by technology alone. We still need to overcome some physical realities, and that's going to require a much more longer planning cycle. And we need the West, we need those that control the rule book to make it a little bit more favorable for the continent.
Thank you very much, Shantha. Does anyone have anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just make my point again. I 100% agree with what everybody's trying to achieve in the kind of industrial sense. I just think we have to be very careful that it's going to employ a lot of people. That I don't, whatever trends you look across globally, that is one that is not going in the direction of employing a lot of people. So that I think for Africa remains a big challenge, that it could still have a very industrialized economy, but it may not have employed a lot of people.
Let me touch a bit on this issue, this emphasis on not employing a lot of people. It will be no different in Africa from anywhere else. If it is not employing a lot of people in China, then yes, it will not employ a lot of people in Africa. The US made the deal, knowingly or unknowingly, a long time ago, to have cheap products and to sell the employment opportunities they had to China. So China made things for them cheaply, sent it over to them, and more people had access to the good things of life. But in return for that, they lost those jobs. And Trump and a number of all these right-wing people, they come and mobilize them without telling them the truth, that this is, you take this, you can't take everything. So Africa will, of course, deal with how this is balanced. But the key thing is that we have got to be self-reliant. There's no reason for us to be worried about job creation, because we can't be competitive in terms of cost of labor. What remains is for us to be competitive in terms of know-how. Once we are competitive in terms of know-how, then whatever is the direction the world is going to, if it is progress in terms of employment generation, or if it is retrogression in favor of robotics, then we gain and suffer together. But the key thing is for us to be competitive, whatever the conditions are.
Oh, just to add, I agree, Von. I just was thinking though, in the agriculture, I mean, it can't be either industry or agriculture. We need both. We need to add value to our agricultural sector. And I was just thinking about how West Africa with the cocoa has just imposed more value for their local farmers. And of course, the chocolate industry didn't like it, but we know they've been exploited and they've been getting a very low price, and voila, we hopefully will have more, at least income coming to those that grow cocoa. So I think if we have to use the agricultural base of the continent. We have plenty of potential land and agricultural productivity, but I think it's also how do we add value and also make sure we feed the continent as a priority ourselves, but then also how do we then use that comparative advantage to add value and make sure that we're not just selling the raw materials as has been the case in the past.
Just one more comment around the issue of technology, productivity, and what it means to labor. I mean, it's as well we started entertaining the fact that, you know, even agriculture needs to be mechanized and also use modern technology for enhancement of productivity. We have had cases in Kenya where, you know, the mechanization of agriculture, simple things like plucking tea, are being resisted by trade unions simply because there's fear that it will replace jobs. But when those investors actually deploy technology, they end up expanding the area of plantations and therefore end up employing people. So I don't want to be captured by the so-called Luddite fallacy by saying that, you know, technology will eventually replace all of us. I think technology is there to enhance productivity, and if productivity enhances competitiveness, there is scope for us to increase production eventually. I don't want to use the example of one saying that let's gain and suffer together, but I think I see technology being an enabler here as opposed to being a barrier to quality of life.
Thank you very much, Jared. Okay, so that'll wrap it up for that question. But just before we finish on kind of a more topical topic, we were wondering how best can Africa emerge from its unique COVID situation to become a kind of more effective and more developed power in the long run? And what are the implications of COVID within Africa?
I can go first. I don't think we know, unfortunately, what the consequences are yet, which is very sad and could be quite tragic if the Indian model is replicated here in Africa. So I worry about that a lot. If Africa got COVID over the next 3 years and it was manageable, it would be fine, I think. But if we have a very strong spike like we're seeing in India, then I think it's going to be very difficult and could be quite tragic. So how we emerge from that, maybe that's a bit of a wake-up call for some of these institutions I was talking about before. But Africa is very, very short of healthcare services, and maybe this will be something that wakes us up to that problem.
I mean, just to add, I think I agree with Guy. We don't know what's going to happen, and we can only pray that we don't end up with a India scenario. But I think what worries me is that we've had a year, and we could have, not just the continent, this is the world, could have planned a lot better to deal with the global pandemic, which requires a level of herd immunity. And I think it shows how tribal the world has become when we can't seem to even have a coherent response to a global crisis. And it shows the inequities. It shows the inequities in access to technology and patents and treatment. It shows how unfair and short-sighted the global system is if it can't come together and figure this out. So I feel a little bit anxious, and I don't know where that leadership's going to come from. I do think we've seen the African Centre for Disease Control do an amazing job. This was after the Ebola crisis. The African CDC was created. It's got an amazing leadership team. I think it's done an extraordinary job at trying to negotiate on the continent's behalf for more vaccines, for its own supply line, for helping to leverage, 54 countries to be able to buy collectively and get better deals. So I hope that the CDC and the AU really continues to grow its capacity to leverage, because I think if the continent does stand together, it can do a lot more. Small countries competing with each other is counterproductive. But I have no faith, and okay, we've just had the Biden administration waiver patents, but I mean, all of this feels like it's coming far too late, and this should have been, scenarios should have been made last year. And we can all congratulate COVAX for its, efforts to build a bit of solidarity, but I find it woefully inadequate. And I don't think anyone should be happy with the current dismal level of vaccination coverage in the continent.
Yeah, let me also agree with those two comments and add that I think it's still an evolving thing. We don't know how it's going to end. I've seen the weaknesses of politicizing the pandemic and making it an ideological argument from places where we expected leadership to come from. Regrettably so, we have also seen nationalism insofar, the rollout of the vaccines, for instance, are concerned, and the lack of infrastructure to roll out the vaccines in continents such as Africa. So what this pandemic has done is to expose our weaknesses and our softness insofar as many things are concerned. If this will be an opportunity for us to reflect deeply on how we can now start addressing those weaknesses, so I think it's for us to seize it. But the bottom line is that so long as some pockets of the world remain unattended to insofar as the pandemic is concerned, you cannot say that it's sorted out completely. If one country is weak the whole chain is weak. So I think that is probably how we should see it. But I agree with Sandra that it has been awfully mismanaged from a global leadership standpoint, and I think we could have done better. That's really my additional comment.
Okay, so one way of looking at this, of course, is to separate the health impact, the human suffering impact from the economic impact, if at all that is possible. At this time, even when Africa has not suffered as much as the US, Europe, and now, unfortunately, also India, the negative, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, the negative economic impact was instantaneous. As soon as COVID started and there were all the disruptions to the global supply chain, because Africa imports every important thing that you can think about, and people were becoming more restrictive, making sure that they could hoard as many important things as possible within their own countries. We had an immediate negative impact. So this impact is going to stay with us for a while, but hopefully we will have learned from it. And whether or not there is a third or fourth wave of COVID that has a health impact as negatively powerful as that of India or not, we will have to think about how to be more self-reliant in Africa, both particularly in our capacity to take care of our health challenges. There's no reason why we should be importing paracetamol and many other drugs that their patents have long expired. And even those ones that have patents, there is no reason why we should not work with the holders to make them here in Africa. We have more than 1 billion consumers here. We ought to be producing more.
Thank you all for your comments on that final question. And unfortunately, we don't have time left to explore many of the issues that have been raised, but hopefully, albeit a slightly somber final end with the COVID discussion, we've come up with some exciting insights into the future of African development.